In the summer of 1990, a teenage girl from Oregon vanished without a trace, leaving her parents adrift in a sea of questions for more than 2 decades. But 22 years later, while leafing through an old high school yearbook, her father noticed something, a single, almost invisible detail that would change everything. That morning, a heavy fog drifted in from the Pacific, wrapping the small coastal town near Hasita Head in its familiar, misty embrace. The lighthouse's beam swept through the haze like a slow heartbeat, barely cutting the gray. Inside a modest clap house perched above the cliffs, Frank Sanders stood at the window of his daughter's bedroom, gazing out at the water. The view had once been his refuge, a reminder of beauty, permanence, and home. But ever since Alicia vanished 22 years ago, the sight of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks had carried a different weight, one that pressed on his chest like an anchor. Turning from the window, his eyes scanned the room, frozen in time. Untouched since that spring day just after her high school graduation, posters still clung to the walls, their edges curling. The desk, neatly arranged with textbooks and notebooks, looked as if Alicia might walk in any moment. Her closet overflowed with clothes that hadn't been touched in more than 2 decades. "It's time," he whispered, recalling the late-night conversation with his wife, Elaine. After years of holding on, they had decided it was finally time to let go, at least of the things. Today, they would sort through her belongings, donate what could help other kids, pack some for storage, and keep a few treasured mementos. Frank unlatched the window, letting in a gust of salt-tinged air that stirred the dust into a lazy dance. He sneezed, wiped his eyes, and walked to the closet. One by one, he removed her clothes, each piece tugging loose a memory. The soft blue sweater she wore on chilly mornings, the shimmering dress from junior prom, the faded jeans patched with clumsy stitches Alicia had sewn herself. He worked slowly, placing items into boxes, donations, storage, keepsakes. When he reached her school supplies, he hesitated. These weren't just notebooks and binders, they were symbols of a future Alicia never had the chance to live. She'd been accepted to the University of Oregon, dreaming of becoming a marine biologist. As Frank sifted through stacks of books, his hand landed on something unexpected, her high school yearbook. He froze. Somehow, in all these years, he had never opened it. Back then, he and Elaine couldn't bear the thought of seeing her smile. Frozen in time alongside classmates who had grown up, moved away, started families. Now, holding the glossy volume, he felt its weight like a relic of a life cut short. Settling on the edge of her bed, he flipped through the pages until he found her senior portrait, her smile bright, hopeful, heartbreakingly alive. "At him 22 years, he whispered, tracing her face with a trembling finger. "I have to learn how to hold you in my heart without all this pain, sweetheart." His gaze slid to the photo beside hers, Amy Davidson, Alicia's best friend. The image brought back echoes of sleepovers, shared secrets, late-night giggles, echoing down the hallway. Amy had visited often in those first months after Alicia disappeared, but then, without explanation, she'd stopped coming. Curious now, Frank turned to the section with student bios. Each senior had a small write-up and a personal quote. On Alicia's page, he read, "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me. To my teachers who pushed me to do better, and to my best friend Amy, don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden, Illustrated, Classic Edition. You old grandma. Love you forever." Frank chuckled, a sound caught between sweetness and sorrow. That playful jab was pure Alicia. He turned the page to Amy's profile, full of big dreams, bold statements, and promises to stand tall in life. But one detail stuck in his mind: The Secret Garden. Alicia had loved that story since childhood, collecting different editions like treasures. Had Amy ever returned it? Driven by the sudden urge to know, Frank searched through Alicia's books. Dust made his eyes water, so he carried the boxes to the living room, unpacking them methodically. Fantasy novels, science textbooks, nature magazines, but no illustrated Secret Garden. The thought flickered again. Could Amy still have it after all these years? On a hunch, he flipped to the back of the yearbook, to the section where students had scribbled phone numbers and addresses. Asterisk, asterisk. Amy had scrawled her phone number in the back of the yearbook with a playful note. "Call me anytime, BFF." Frank dialed it without much hope, the faded digits trembling in his hands. As expected, an automated voice told him the number was no longer in service. He sighed, about to close the book, when the front door swung open. Elaine stepped inside, balancing canvas grocery bags from the Saturday farmers market. She froze in the doorway, her eyes darting from the books and magazines spread across the living room floor to the half-open boxes on the couch. "Frank, what is all this?" Her voice was calm at first, but under the surface, he could hear something sharper, something raw. "I was just going through Alicia's things, like we talked about," he replied, standing up, brushing dust from his hands. Elaine's face tightened. "We agreed to sort and store her things, not scatter them everywhere. I thought we were moving forward, not." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I'm not dwelling." "Elaine," he said quickly, "I found her yearbook," and her eyes narrowed slightly. "And what could be so important in there?" He opened the book and pointed to Alicia Sr., quote, his voice softening. "She mentioned a book, The Secret Garden. Said Amy borrowed it. I just wanted to see if it was here." Elaine exhaled slowly, the sound more weary than angry. "Frank, it's a book. It doesn't matter anymore. And we don't need to dig all this up, especially not with Amy. She's probably forgotten." "Do you know where she is now?" he asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. Elaine hesitated, then nodded. "I see her sometimes when I'm in town. She lives in a camper now." She began unpacking vegetables onto the counter, her movements precise, almost mechanical. "I thought maybe I'd visit her," he said. "Not just for the book. It's been so long. She was like family once." Elaine's hands stilled. She turned toward him, her gaze steady but guarded. "Frank, not today. I have nothing against Amy, but I'm not ready to see her. Last night, we agreed we'd clean up, let go. Going to see Amy feels like the opposite of that." She gestured toward the room, the dust, the piles of memories. "I'll stay here, pack things for the attic. If you want to go, that's your choice." He nodded slowly. "It's just an idea. I'll go alone." She gave him directions, then added softly, "Don't push her, Frank. Alicia's disappearance, it broke her too." Minutes later, he was at the door, yearbook tucked under his arm, phone and wallet in his pocket. Elaine had already turned back to stacking Alicia's books into neat rows. He felt a pang of guilt for leaving her with the mess, but something deep inside was pulling him toward Amy, toward a truth he couldn't name yet. Outside, the late morning mist clung to the cliffs near Hesita Head, Frank's old sedan wound. Along the coastal highway, the ocean on his left, a restless stretch of silver under the fog. 20 minutes later, he turned into a small camper park tucked beside a grove of evergreens. A dozen trailers and RVs stood in uneven rows, some surrounded by flower pots and lawn chairs, others bare and weathered. He spotted a man wiping down the windows of a large RV and called out, "Excuse me, looking for Amy Davidson. Do you know which one's hers?" The man pointed toward a blue and white camper at the far end. "That's Amy. Quiet lady. Keeps to herself." Frank thanked him and walked the narrow gravel path. Up close, the camper looked cared for, clean windows, a small potted fern beside the steps. He took a breath, steadied his hand, and knocked. A moment later, the door opened. A woman in her early 40s stood there, blonde hair streaked with silver, her face marked with fine lines life had carved over the years. Her eyes scanned him politely, but without recognition. "Can I help you?" she asked. Frank's throat tightened. "Amy, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's father." Her eyes widened instantly, filling with a cascade of emotions, recognition, sorrow, and something like warmth, all at once. "Oh my goodness, Mr. Sanders," Amy breathed, her voice trembling with surprise. "Please come in." She stepped back, opening the narrow door, and Frank climbed the 2 short steps into a space that was unexpectedly warm and inviting. The camper smelled faintly of brewed coffee and cedar, with sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Photographs lined the walls, snapshots of beaches, old friends, and a younger Amy with hair wild in the wind. Small potted plants balanced on shelves, and colorful pillows softened the built-in benches. "Have a seat," Amy said, motioning toward the compact dining area. Coffee would be nice." "Thank you," Frank replied, settling onto the cushioned bench. Amy moved with deliberate, measured steps, almost as if each motion was buying her time to process the sudden reappearance of a man tied to one of the most painful chapters of her life. She placed a steaming mug in front of him before sitting down across the table. "So, what brings you here after all these years?" Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out the yearbook. its cover worn smooth with time. I found this today while going through Alicia's room. Funny thing is, I realized I'd never actually opened it until now. Amy's eyes softened as her fingers brushed the embossed cover. I remember this, she said quietly, as if speaking to herself. Frank flipped to Alicia's profile page and tapped the handwritten note about the secret garden. She mentioned you borrowed this. I was wondering, did you ever return it? A wistful smile touched Amy's face. No, I didn't. I was scatterbrained back then, and Alicia loved teasing me for it. After she disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to give it back. It's the last piece of her I have. She rose, crossed to a small storage cabinet under her bed, and pulled out a worn, beautifully illustrated copy of The Secret Garden. She held it like it might shatter. Would you mind if I kept it? It's been, well, a kind of comfort to me. Of course, Frank said gently. Still, Amy handed him the book, letting him open it for the first time. The pages were yellowed, the spine softened by years of use, but the artwork remained vivid gardens, blooming in ink and watercolor. As he turned the pages, something thin and crinkled slid out. It was a torn sheet from a teen fashion magazine. Frank unfolded it, revealing a photo spread of young models. One boy's face caught his attention, a sharp jaw, confident smirk. There was something familiar about him. Who's this? Amy leaned over to look. That's Jason Murray. He was in our class. Did some modeling back then. Still does. I think he even has his own clothing line now. Frank's brow furrowed. Elaine once mentioned you dated him. Amy's expression shifted instantly. That's not true. I never dated Jason. Honestly, I didn't even like him. Alicia was the one he seemed interested in. For a while, Frank blinkered. Alicia, yeah, junior year, maybe for a few months. But once we figured out what kind of guy he really was, we both kept our distance. Or, I thought we did. Amy hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the window. Now that I think about it, during senior year I saw them talking a few times, which was strange. We'd already agreed he was bad news. And Alicia, she asked me questions about him. If I thought people like Jason could change, if maybe he wasn't as bad as we believed. She even asked me once to drive past his house just to see where he lived. Frank's pulse quickened. Did you tell the police any of this?
Yes,
Amy said firmly. They questioned everyone in our class, including Jason. But by then, Alicia was dating Brandon Knox. He's the one they focused on in the beginning. Frank nodded slowly. I remember Brandon. He came by the house a few times to pick her up. We suspected him too, but his alibi was solid. He leaned forward slightly. Do you know what happened to Brandon? Branken, Frank asked. Last I heard, he left town not long after Alicia vanished. Amy replied. The scrutiny was too much. I think he just needed to get away. Frank's mind kept churning. And Jason, what about him? Amy shook her head. I'm not sure there was ever anything between them. Alicia didn't seem interested, at least, not beyond those strange questions she asked. Frank glanced again at Jason's face in the torn magazine page. Why would she use his picture as a bookmark? Amy gave a faint, almost ironic smile. Because she hated him. That magazine was her favorite, but she ripped out the page with his face just so she wouldn't have to see it, folded it up and said, "There's nothing better for it than to be stuck between the pages of something worth reading." Frank let that sink in, though the answer didn't erase his unease. Do you know where Jason is now? Amy picked up her phone, scrolling through recent messages. Actually, our high school alumni group had a reunion last weekend at Jason's house. I didn't go, but they posted his address in the chat. She turned the screen toward him. Would you mind sending that to me? Frank asked, pulling out his phone. They exchanged numbers, and a moment later his screen lit up with the message. Amy hesitated. Frank, do you think Jason might be involved in what happened to Alicia? I don't know, he admitted. But I do know this Elaine, and I never even knew they spoke. With Brandon, it was open. With Jason, it was hidden. That makes me curious. He stood, tucking the yearbook under his arm. Thank you, Amy. And yes, I'll tell Elaine you said hello, and keep the book. I understand why it matters to you. Amy's hand lingered on his arm for a moment. It's the last thing of hers I have. Frank stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the smell of salt water riding the breeze. He slid into the driver's seat, the yearbook on the passenger, sighed like a silent passenger. The revelation about Jason was unsettling, not so much because of the man himself, but because Alicia had kept it from him. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Ron Keller, the now retired investigator who had once carried the weight of Alicia's case. No answer, just voicemail. Frank ended the call and stared at the address Amy had sent him. He should go home. Elaine would be waiting. But the questions Amy had stirred up refused to quiet. Just a quick drive-by, he told himself, just to see. 20 minutes later, Frank was winding through one of the wealthiest neighborhoods along the Oregon coast, far from the modest clapboard house where Alicia had grown up. Elegant homes with perfect lawns lined the streets, their silence broken only by the occasional hiss of sprinklers. He spotted Jason's address, eastly, a sprawling two-story with a circular drive and a manicured garden that looked like it had been designed for magazine spreads. Parking across the street, Frank watched. The front gate stood open. After a moment, a man emerged, walking alongside a young woman toward her car. Even after more than 2 decades, Frank recognized him, the same sharp features from the yearbook, now aged into a confident, polished face. Jason Murray still carried himself like someone who expected to be noticed. He kissed the woman's cheek, waved as she drove off, then turned back toward the house. That's when his gaze caught Frank's. Frank realized too late that his car windows weren't tinted. Jason's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing. Frank sighed. No point in pretending. He shut off the engine, got out, and walked toward the gate. "Good afternoon," he called, aiming for casual. "Jason Murray, isn't it?" Jason didn't return the pleasantry. "Who are you?" he asked sharply. "And why are you watching my house?" "You paparazzi, a reporter." Jason's voice cut like a blade. "I'm sorry, didn't mean to intrude," Frank said, stopping several feet short of the gate. "My name's Frank Sanders. I'm Alicia Sanders' father. She was in your graduating class, went missing 22 years ago." Something shifted in Jason's face. His posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing to a guarded squint. "What do you want?" Frank kept his tone steady. "I heard there was a class reunion here last weekend. I'm just trying to piece together anything about my daughter. Someone told me you might have been close to her once." Jason's jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" "Amy. She didn't even come to the reunion." "I'm not here to stir up trouble," Frank said, raising his palms slightly. "I'm looking for answers. It's been more than 2 decades, and we still don't know what happened to Alicia." Jason's reply came quick and sharp. "Why ask me? I was never her boyfriend, barely knew her, never had that kind of interest in her. I told the police that years ago, and I don't appreciate being questioned again." Frank blinked, caught off guard by the heat in Jason's tone. "I never said you were her boyfriend. I just heard you two spoke sometimes." "If we ever talked," Jason said, his voice dismissive, "it was probably because I borrowed a couple bucks or needed help with homework. I always paid back what I owed. There was never a problem between us." The cops already heard all this. Frank studied him carefully. The words were casual, but Jason's body betrayed him, shifting his weight. Glancing toward the street, scanning for onlookers, his shoulders seemed coiled, like a man waiting for something to go wrong. "I don't get why you're here now," Jason went on, his tone hardening. "I've got a reputation to protect. I don't need reporters or anyone seeing us together and starting rumors." Before Frank could answer, Jason turned and strode toward his front door. "You should leave. I have nothing else to say about Alicia Sanders." Frank stood rooted for a moment, stunned at how quickly the conversation had soured. The defensiveness was too much for a man claiming there'd been nothing between them. Why would a successful businessman still bristle so fiercely over a high school acquaintance from 20 years ago? Jason vanished inside, and Frank made his way back to his car, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He felt foolish for ignoring Elaine's plea to let this go. "What was I thinking?" he muttered. "I promised her we'd close this chapter, not rip it wide open again." He started the engine, giving Jason's house one last glance before pulling away. Elaine would be hurt if she knew where he'd gone. And yet, try as he might, Frank couldn't shake the image of Jason's face when he'd said Alicia's name. It wasn't just annoyance. It had been something sharper. The sensible thing would be to drive home, unload boxes, and honor his promise. But as the coastal highway curved back toward town, Frank's mind kept replaying the encounter. Jason's hostility, the darting eyes, the way his voice had cracked, ever so slightly, on Alicia's name. He told himself to forget it until, without fully realizing, he found himself turning onto a side street. The sign ahead read Mornington Memorial Funeral Home. Frank slowed as he approached, and froze. Across the lot, Jason Murray stood at the cashier window, signing papers. Beside him, on the counter, was a brand new shovel and a small wooden box. Frank's pulse thundered. He ducked low, sliding into his car seat, peering through the rearview mirror as Jason walked to his vehicle. The man loaded both items into the back, his movements brisk and deliberate. Frank's mind churned. Why would Jason on a quiet Sunday afternoon be buying a shovel and a box from a funeral home? Frank stayed low in the car, watching as Jason strode past the funeral home toward the small floral shop next to the hardware store. Minutes later, he reappeared, a bouquet of white hyacinths cradled in his arm. White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite a chill shot through Frank's chest. It could have been coincidence lots of people liked those flowers, but paired with the shovel, the wooden box, and Jason's edgy defensiveness earlier, it was too much to ignore. His pulse kicked hard against his ribs. Jason placed the flowers in his car, slid behind the wheel, and drove off, without giving himself time to reconsider or think about what Elaine would say. Frank started his engine and eased out after him, keeping several car lengths back. The route wound through town, then cut toward the coastal highway. Signs flashed. Bahasita head to the north, Cape Creek to the south, but Jason veered off toward Whitlow Cliff, a rugged stretch of coastline dotted with vacation cottages and framed by wind-bent evergreens. Frank kept his distance as Jason turned onto a private drive. At its end stood a small cedar-shingled cottage perched precariously near the cliff's edge, the kind of place with million-dollar views and a silence that felt ancient. Driving past, Frank parked a quarter-mile up the road, tucking his car into the shadows beneath a stand of coastal pines. He slipped out, moving quietly through the brush until the cottage came into view below. Jason appeared at the door, carrying a gallon jug of water. He loaded it into a small garden trolley, along with the shovel, the wooden box, and the hyacinth. Then, with a glance toward the empty driveway, he started down a narrow path that disappeared toward the cliffside. Frank waited until Jason was 50 yards ahead before stepping out of cover, keeping to the pines as the trail curved through scrub, brush and wildflowers. The air was heavy with salt and the faint sweet scent of blooming lupin. The path ended at a secluded overlook, the Pacific stretching endlessly beneath a sky streaked gold by the lowering sun. Frank crouched behind a jagged rock, his breath shallow. Jason stopped near the cliff's edge, scanning the horizon, then began to dig. The soil was rocky, stubborn, reluctant to give way. 2 feet down, he set aside the shovel and knelt. He lifted the wooden lid. From his hiding place, Frank couldn't see inside, but Jason's face, it softened, a kind of reverence settling over his features. His lips moved silent words, maybe names, maybe apologies. He lifted several sheets of paper, reading them slowly, his eyes distant. Then, with a sudden breath of wind, the papers tore free. They scattered like startled birds, swirling toward the brush and the drop-off. Jason cursed under his breath, snapping the box shut before more could escape. He lunged after the loose pages, scooping them up, brushing off sand. When all were gathered, he placed the box into the hole, laid the hyacinths gently on top, then shoveled the earth back in. He tamped it down, poured water over the mound, and stood in silence. The ocean roared below. Gulls wheeled in the wind. Jason spoke, his voice low, but clear enough for Frank to hear. "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." Frank's body reacted before his mind did, a jolt like a live wire through his spine. His heels slipped on loose gravel, sending a scatter of pebbles down the slope. He caught himself against a tree trunk, freezing. Jason's head snapped up. His eyes swept the cliffside. "Hello?" His voice was sharp now, probing the air. "Is someone there?" Frank held his breath, every muscle locked, his heartbeat pounding so hard it felt audible. He stayed still, hidden in the shadows, praying the wind and waves would mask the sound of his existence. Jason picked up the shovel and stepped toward the brush where Frank was hidden. His eyes swept the undergrowth, head cocked slightly. Listening, Frank pressed his back hard against the rough bark of the tree, forcing himself to be as still as stone. Every second dragged like a minute. Finally, Jason muttered, "Just the wind," though the edge in his voice betrayed doubt. He lingered a moment longer, then began pacing the perimeter, scanning the clearing as if memorizing every shadow. Only when seemingly satisfied did he gather his tools. but instead of heading directly back, he looped around the far side of the cliff, vanishing from sight. Frank waited, silently counting to 100 before moving. The place was still. No footsteps, no voices. His legs felt shaky as he emerged from cover, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The mound of fresh earth stood out like a wound on the cliffside. He had to know Dot at the cottage. The shovel leaned against the wall where Jason had left it. Frank grabbed it and hurried back, his hands trembling, heart pounding. He began to dig, fast but careful. The soil was still damp, breaking apart easily. The sweet scent of hyacinths filled the air as he uncovered the flowers, setting them gently aside. The blade struck wood. The box stopped before he could bend down. A voice cut through the salt air, cold and certain. "I knew someone was out here." "I was right," Frank spun. Jason stood just yards away, his expression a twisted mix of fury and satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come back," Jason said, stepping forward. "I saw your car up the road, circled back through the trees. What do you think you're doing?" Frank's grip tightened on the shovel, not just as a tool, but as protection. "I heard you say my daughter's name," he said, forcing his voice steady. "What have you buried here, Jason? What does Alicia have to do with this?" Jason's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't be here." Frank turned back toward the hole. "I'm going to find out." "Stop." Jason barked, and suddenly there was a gun in his hand. "Drop the shovel." Frank raised his hands, pulse thundering. In the same motion, he pulled his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling the police. They need to see this." "Go ahead. Shoot me if you want. I'll be with my daughter again, but I'm one button away from alerting them." Jason lunged, knocking the phone from Frank's grip. It skittered toward the cliff's edge. "No." Frank dove, kicking out instinctively, sending the gun clattering over the rocks into the ocean far below. He caught the phone just before it slipped away and slammed his thumb against the SOS button. Somewhere, miles away, emergency systems lit up with his coordinates. "Stop this, Jason," Frank said, backing away, his chest heaving. "The police are coming. Tell me the truth. Alicia's gone. Nothing can change that. Hiding it won't help anyone. You don't understand." Jason shouted, face flushed with panic. "I have my whole life ahead of me, my business, my reputation. I can't let this destroy me." Frank's voice cracked. "Did you kill my daughter? If you loved her, why would you hurt her? She was my only child." Jason's eyes flickered with something raw and dangerous. "I never knew what I felt for her," he said, his tone twisted. "She should have stayed away from me. And if you'd really loved your daughter, you'd have protected her better." Frank's stomach dropped. "What are you saying? You never knew her like I did," Jason snapped, gripping the shovel so tightly his knuckles blanched. "You didn't see the way she kept coming back over and over. Then why didn't you speak up when she disappeared?" Frank demanded. "Why bury something out here like a grave?" Jason's voice turned venomous. "She betrayed me." Before Frank could react, Jason lunged. The shovel's handle slammed into Frank's chest, knocking him off balance. Jason's hand clamped around his throat, driving him backward. Frank clawed at his arm, the younger man's strength overwhelming him. His vision began to blur, black spots crowding the edges, and then faint, at first. Then growing came the wail of sirens, carried on the wind from the road above the cliff. Jason's grip faltered. For a single ragged breath, Frank could breathe. Again, Jason's grip faltered as the sound of approaching sirens sliced through the coastal quiet. Panic flared in his eyes. 2 police cruisers came into view on the narrow drive. Lights flashing, sirens wailing, the sound echoing off the cliffs. Moments later, uniformed officers poured into the clearing, weapons drawn. "Let him go. Step back, hands where we can see them." Jason released Frank, the shovel slipping from his fingers with a dull thud. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he raised his hands. 2 officers moved in fast, wrenching his arms behind his back, snapping the cuffs on with practiced efficiency while reciting his rights. Frank dropped to his knees, coughing, his hand pressed to his bruised throat. A female officer crouched beside him. "Sir, are you all right?" Frank's voice was ragged. "Yeah, thank you." She helped him to his feet, steadying him as he found his balance. As Jason was led toward a waiting cruiser, Frank pointed to the mound of disturbed soil. "There, he buried something there. And he said my daughter's name, Alicia Sanders. She went missing 22 years ago." The officer's expression sharpened. "Sanders, I remember that case." She gestured to a colleague. "Get Detective Ramirez over here." Within moments, a tall, dark-haired detective in a windbreaker approached, handing Frank his phone. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Detective Ramirez. Walk me through what happened." Frank told her everything: the yearbook, Amy, the strange meeting at Jason's home, the funeral home, the flowers, the drive out to the cliff. "I know I shouldn't have followed him," he admitted, his voice low. "But when I saw him by a shovel and white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite song, in my gut told me it was connected." Ramirez nodded once. "You said he buried something." Frank pointed to the fresh mound, a wooden box with the flowers on top. "Before that, the wind blew papers. Out he gathered them up, and then he said." Frank swallowed. He said, "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." The detective motioned to the arriving forensic unit. "Let's see what we've got." They worked quickly, the quiet punctuated only by the scrape of shovels. First came the bouquet, still fresh, still fragrant. Beneath it, the wooden box. The lead tech eased it open under Ramirez's watchful eye. Inside was a stack of folded papers, photographs, and printed text messages, their edges curled with age. Nestled among them was a small woolen doll, clearly handmade, the kind a child might create at a school craft table. "He's been keeping these all this time," Frank murmured, his stomach twisting. Gloved Ramirez began examining the papers. The earliest items were printouts of messages between Jason and Alicia, dated to their high school years. As the detective read, her expression tightened. "Mr. Sanders, these suggest they were in a secret relationship," she said carefully. "It appears complicated." Frank stepped closer, scanning the texts himself. His heart ached as the story unfolded. Alicia meeting Jason with friends. Jason insisting Amy not come, the night he kissed her without consent. Alicia's initial outrage softening over time, her messages turning hopeful, almost pleading. She believed she could help him change. He strung her along, never committing, using her affection like a safety net. For nearly a year, it continued until Alicia finally ended it and began dating Brandon Knox. The later messages darkened Jason's tone, shifting from desperation to simmering anger. Ramirez turned the next set of photos over slowly, almost as if bracing herself. Frank caught a glimpse and felt his stomach lurch. Alicia bound, terrified. The background was unmistakable, the same rustic wood walls of the cliffside cottage, and other shots clearly taken in the surrounding woods. Frank turned away, his throat burning. "Oh my God, Elaine." Detective Ramirez quickly flipped the photographs face down, shielding them from view, but her gloved hands didn't stop moving. She turned each one over, scanning the backs. The handwriting slanted erraticus, unmistakably Jason's. On one, the back was filled, edge to edge, with a single sentence repeated over and over. "You must still love me. You must still love me. You must still love me." Another had a short, almost cheerful scrawl. "Had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay." But the last made the detective's jaw tighten. It showed Alicia's face, wide-eyed and stricken with fear. Across the back, Jason had written a rambling confession, his thoughts unraveling, how he couldn't keep it together, how they were looking for her, how she here, the profanity scrawled in anger, had refused to talk things out. The final lines chilled the air around them. "I'm sorry I had to kill you. If I didn't, they would have found you and taken me. You'll always be in my heart, even if no one knows about us." Ramirez turned to a nearby officer, her voice low but firm. "We'll need to question him on the exact details. He doesn't say how, but this is as close to a confession as we'll get without hearing it from his mouth." Before she could say more, a second team of officers approached from the tree line. Their expressions were grave. "Detective, 15 feet from here, we found an area where the soil looks different. We did a preliminary dig, and there are bone fragments." Frank's knees buckled. He sank to the ground, the words striking like a hammer. After 22 years of searching, of fragile hope and false leads, the truth was finally clawing its way into the light. The forensic team expanded their excavation, the rhythmic scrape of shovels marking the hours as the afternoon sun slid lower toward the horizon. Piece by piece, they uncovered the fragile remains of Alicia Sanders. Detective Ramirez approached Frank, who sat silently in the grass, eyes fixed on the site. "Mr. Sanders, would you like us to call your wife?" Frank nodded numbly. "Yes, and please call Amy Davidson. She was Alicia's best friend. She should know." When Ramirez gently suggested he wait at the station, Frank shook his head. "No, I'm staying. Elaine and Amy need to see this, just as I do. We've waited 22 years for answers. I'll see this through." An hour later, Elaine arrived, pale and trembling. She ran straight into Frank's arms, and they held each other while Detective Ramirez quietly explained what had been found. Amy followed soon after, her face streaked with tears, her eyes already red from the drive. The three of them, father, mother, friend, stood together at the edge of the taped-off site, united in grief as the last pieces of Alicia's story were revealed. Elaine turned to Ramirez, her voice unsteady but resolute. "We want to take her from here. She deserves a proper burial. Not to be left in this place." "You'll have her," Ramirez promised softly. "As soon as our team finishes, she'll be released to you, no more than a day or two." Amy stepped toward the remains, her tears falling freely. "Why didn't you tell me, Alicia?" she whispered. "We used to laugh about girls who fell for guys like Jason. I could have helped you. I don't understand." The sun was sinking now, casting the Pacific in bands of copper and gold. The wind off the cliffs was cool, but Frank didn't move. His fingers locked around Ellen's. "She's coming home," he murmured. "After all this time, she's finally coming home." 1 week later, the sea was calm, an uncharacteristic clarity bathing the Oregon coast in sunlight. A small flotilla of boats gathered in the blue-green water below Whitlow Cliff. In the lead boat stood Frank and Elaine Sanders, Amy Davidson at their side. With them were Detective Ron Keller, coaxed out of retirement to witness the final chapter, and Detective Ramirez, who had carried the case to its end, behind them. In the other boats came Alicia's former classmates, teachers, and the principal from Mornington High. They were there not for spectacle, but for closure for the girl who had vanished one spring day, and whose story had lived in whispers for 2 decades. The news of Jason Murray's arrest and the recovery of Alicia Sanders remained swept through the small Oregon coastal town like a tide no one could stop. For over 2 decades, her absence had been a wound the community learned to live with but never healed from. Now, that wound was open again, raw and aching, but at last, the truth had a name. On a sunlit morning, Frank stood at the bow of a gently rocking boat, a small urn cradled in his hands. He and Elaine had decided against a cemetery, against the idea of their daughter confined to the earth. Alicia had loved the ocean, had dreamed of devoting her life to it. Today, they would give her back to it. "Today we gather to finally say goodbye to Alicia Sanders." The minister's voice carried across the water to the flotilla of boats gathered behind them. For 22 years, her family and friends have carried the weight of her absence, the pain of not knowing. Today, we lay that burden down and commit Alicia's remains to the sea, where she will never again be bound. Elaine stepped forward, her hand warm on Frank's arm. "Alicia loved the ocean," she said, her voice catching but steady. "She was studying to become a marine biologist. She would have loved knowing she'd be part of the sea she adored." Frank opened the urn. Together, he and Elaine let the wind take Alicia's ashes, the fine particles drifting into the water below. From every boat, friends and classmates tossed white hyacinths, her favorite, until the ocean bloomed with floating petals. Amy stepped forward last, tears streaming down her cheeks. In her hands was the worn, illustrated copy of The Secret Garden. She placed it gently on the surface of the water, where it bobbed for a moment before drifting away. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered. "I'm sorry I never returned your book." As the boats turned toward shore, Detective Ramirez joined Frank and Elaine at the bow. Her voice was low, private. "Jason confessed. He gave us the full story. Jason had kept Alicia captive in the cliffside cottage for several days after abducting her. He admitted he had been obsessed with her since their brief secret relationship in high school and couldn't accept that she had moved on with Brandon Knox. He had begged her to break up with Brandon and tell everyone she'd gone on a solo graduation trip. Alicia refused. She told him she had spent years trying to love him, believing he could change, but she'd finally realized he was broken beyond repair. Ramirez's tone was steady, but the words were knives. Jason said her rejection cut deep. They fought when she tried to escape. She nearly pushed him over the cliff, but in a rage, he overpowered her, striking her with rocks until she lay still. Panicked, he buried her in the woods and never spoke of it again. Amy wiped away fresh tears. "I remember when she started asking me if Jason could change. I didn't understand that she'd always disliked him. I never knew they were involved. If I had, maybe I could have warned her. It's not your fault, Elaine said firmly. Jason was manipulative. Alicia's compassion was her greatest gift and he twisted it against her. Ron Keller, the retired detective who had chased every lead in the early years, shook his head. She never went public about Jason. No record, no history. We focused on Brandon. Jason just went on with his life. We never looked his way again. Back at the dock, Frank lingered for a moment, watching the hyacinths drift farther out to sea. The pain wasn't gone, it never would be, but for the first time, it was a pain with an ending. That evening, as the sun dipped toward the Pacific, Frank and Elaine sat together on their back porch. Between them sat a framed photo, not her formal senior portrait, but Alicia as they wanted to remember her, laughing barefoot on the beach, hair wild in the wind, eyes alive with joy. The waves whispered in the distance, carrying her spirit out into the endless blue. She's home now, Frank said softly. Elaine didn't answer, but her hand tightened in his, and together they watched the sun sink into the sea. I think, Elaine said softly, her fingers curling into Frank's, we can finally move forward now, not by forgetting her, but by remembering her as she really was, vibrant, loving, full of compassion. Frank squeezed her hand. She was so much like you. That way she had of believing in people, of wanting to help them be better. Elaine's lips curved into a faint, wistful smile. And she had your stubborn streak. Once she decided someone was worth saving, nothing, no warning, no reason could change her mind. They sat quietly for a while, the weight of their grief no longer a wall between them, but a thread binding them together, tested, frayed, but unbroken. I keep thinking about how young she was, Frank said at last, how innocent even. After everything, she believed in the power of love to change people. That's not a bad thing to believe, Elaine replied, her voice gentle but sure. The world needs more hearts like hers. Alicia's mistake wasn't believing people could change, was thinking she could be the one to make it happen. Frank nodded, the truth settling deep. I just wish she'd told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see the danger. We'll never know, Elaine said quietly. But I think, wherever she is now, she knows how much we loved her, and she knows we never stopped looking. The last of the daylight slipped into the Pacific, the stars emerging in a deepening sky. From their porch, the sound of the waves reached them, steady and eternal. Frank thought about the week that had brought them here, how a single, half-forgotten yearbook and a note about a borrowed book had unraveled a mystery. 22 years in the making. Alicia's disappearance had an answer now, but the question of how to live with the space she left behind, that was one they would carry for the rest of their lives. Yet for the first time in decades, Frank felt something like peace. Alicia was no longer lost to the unknown. She was part of the sea. She had loved free, untethered, infinite. He looked at Elaine, her hand still warm in his. Together, they would go on. They would remember, and maybe, finally, they would heal.